welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming here today. I will shortly introduce our two guests, Kirt CONRAD and Bertrand GUILLOTIN, who are here to talk about the American energy policy. So let me start with you, Mr. CONRAD. You've been the CEO of Sarta company in Ohio since 2009. With your company, you've decided to pave the way to zero-emission vehicles and have been working on hydrogen buses. Along with the Ohio State University, you have launched the Midwest Center for Excellence in Renewable Energy. So it seems that the issue of sustainability is important for you and your actions as a technology manager. As for you, Mr. Guillotin, you've joined the Fox School of Business in 2015 after a worldwide successful career. You've done business in 30 countries and spent 25 years outside of France. And you have published a thesis on the differentiation and globalization of business goals. It seems you have a very global point of view in the business world, which will enable us to understand how energy policies can be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for this introduction. Can you hear me okay? No? Yes, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's it. I see some familiar faces, so thank you again for having us. This is an honor for us to be here. As mentioned, my name is Bertrand Guillotin. I'm going to show you the agenda, which basically 4 categories. I will basically focus on introductions to give you a little bit more details, some of the landmark changes, as well as shifts in US energy policy. And my colleague, Kirt, is actually going to focus on the current best practices in the US, for which he's actually directly responsible. We will compare them with Europe to give you a good framework to look at the differences and similarities. And then we will close with conclusion. So we will basically take each of us about 20 minutes, and then you'll have 20 minutes for questions. So you can already prepare some of the questions if you wish. So as mentioned, I am French. I am from Lorraine, but I actually studied both in Europe, in France, as well as in the US. I enjoy both countries, but I would say that the topic is well chosen for this festival, for this conference, because really it's an important topic, and it's a topic that basically impacts not just Europe and the US, but the world. As mentioned, my colleague has been the CEO of Sarta, which is a huge transit system in the US. He is a leader in alternative energy and hydrogen cell fuels. You want to say a few words?
One thing, my friend here did mention he's from France, but most people back home say that I come here to the school as an excuse to travel to France. So we're very honored to be here today. And like Bertrand said, we have one of the largest fuel cell fleets in the United States, and actually one of the largest ones in the world, and we'll get into that here in a little bit.
Thank you. All right, so in order to set the stage, you start thinking about energy and a big picture. And again, Claire, thank you for the introduction. I forgot to mention the sponsors behind us. We thank them, of course, greatly for their support. When you think about energy, you think globally, you think about what really matters. What is the impact of energy on business? What is the impact of the different industries in the energy sector in the world? And basically, you know, when I think about it, the first thing I think about is this. And I remember when I was actually growing up in France when the Amoco Cadiz disaster happened. And basically, you know, if you look at the numbers, it's 6% of the global GDP, which according to the World Bank today is about $120 trillion. So it's basically $7 trillion, which is about twice the GDP of France. This is just the energy portion in terms of oil and gas industry, right? The sector within all the energy industries that you can look at. So, of course, it's not fair to say that oil and gas is responsible for disasters, right? It's just to basically prompt your thinking about the potential consequences when we don't have a tight energy policy which does not necessarily connect with stakeholders, especially the environment, people, animals, and so forth. When I was growing up in France, this was a big deal. I think it was a big deal for the environment for the long term. And we also need to mention that the contributions of the oil and gas industry is not necessarily just about disasters, but so also about productivity. And without the oil and gas industry, I don't think that the world economy at this point would function very well. Unfortunately, this happened again recently in the US. And as you may have noticed, if you travel to the US, everything is bigger there. So unfortunately, this disaster was bigger as well. But seriously, you know, I think we could spend the entire session on this type of subject. I will not do so. This is, again, just to introduce the importance of oil and gas. The point in the matter is people are still trying to recover from this. And the next quote from one of the House representatives, so a member of the l'Assemblée nationale in the US, is actually very concise and very powerful. People do want smart energy policy. The question is, you know, what does it look like? What is a smart energy policy? And how do we make actually American energy policy great again? So the focus today, we argue that this smart energy policy should actually include renewable energies. And this is not something that is the result of a consensus in the US. This is just based on our research insights and the preparation for today's discussion. So of course, we need to discuss the changes in US energy policy. And then you can ask us, you can discuss with us, you know, whether or not there are smart changes. But I would say, first of all, there are major changes. And then, as mentioned, Kirt will discuss the best practices. So it's also important to put energy policy in the background of the economic plan of the current president, President Trump. Taxes, trade, regulations, energy and infrastructure spending to make improvements to the infrastructure of the US. So we are focusing on one of the 5 major portions or elements of the president's economic plan and reforms. I highlighted a few of them here. You probably already know that permanent tax changes were made to benefit corporations in the US, and that reduction was a 40% reduction. It's basically cutting in half, right, the tax bill of companies. So it's permanent. The changes that you may have heard about that concern individuals like Kirt and I are not permanent. So the second point I would say is that, of course, we know it today, tariffs are being discussed. The European Union is about to potentially retaliate to the changes proposed by the Trump administration, imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from basically countries outside the US except for Canada and Mexico. And the EU will probably negotiate some exception, but the tariffs have been imposed on those metals and also previously on photovoltaic panels and washing machines. So there's definitely a protectionist agenda, right? There's an America First policy. And the next point I want to make here is that, well, since 2017, basically, there are a lot of changes in the energy/environmental circles. So these are the three topics. First of all, 2016, or the 3 major changes, the export crude oil from the US, which had been in place for 40 years, was lifted. So now it's actually possible, legal, to export crude oil. And it's happening as we speak. 2017, as you know, the Trump administration basically pulled out of the Paris Agreement. 2018, there's a definite refocus on fossil fuels and drilling. This is basically how we can sum up this, this change in 2016. I'm not going to read all the consequences in the interest of time, but since I'm from Philadelphia, I can tell you the port capacity to export oil is doubling at this point. So there's a $300 million investment to make the port bigger, more efficient. 2017, as mentioned, the decision to exit the Paris Agreement. The US joined basically only 2 countries in the world, Syria and Nicaragua, were the only ones who did not embrace this agreement. 2018, basically, we are almost back to the future, right? Refocusing on fossil fuel and drilling. I think this basically sums it up, you know. And these are some of the changes. So this is very busy. The slides are going to be on the web, so you don't need to, you know, take all the notes, because I've got more changes to communicate. What's interesting, I think, is that Congress has basically refused to put some of those changes in practice. It's probably not the first time, not the last time, but a lot of changes have been basically proposed, and Congress has not embraced them. These are a few more. So as you can see, it's fair to say, whether or not you agree with those changes, that the president has been pretty busy in terms of energy. So as promised, I'm now going to pass it on to Kirt for him to discuss current best practices, US and Europe.
Well, thank you. Thank you for listening to us. I'll try to be as eloquent as my partner was here. The topics we're going to look at is electric generation in the United States, looking at how it's generated here in France, looking at alternatives that have been developed in the United States, and then looking at transportation and how that's moving. One of the things you can't really separate, energy when you're talking about electricity from oil and gas. They're really merging when you're talking about the electrification of transportation and moving to zero emissions. So really you've got the 2 streams of energy really that have been segregated in the past really merging together. What this graph here shows is electric generation in the United States. And the one thing you do see in the blue is natural gas generation is overtaking coal in the United States. A lot of that really has to do with the economics of natural gas. There's been, if you've been hearing about hydraulic fracturing, from what I understand, that's been banned here in France. However, in the United States, it's pretty well used. Those of you that don't understand exactly what hydraulic fracking is, basically shale, probably close to 1,000 to 2,000 meters in the ground is captured in the shale, and so what happens is you'll drill down to that level, and they've invented a way to curve the drilling apparatus to go out. And so if you could imagine an upside down octopus where it's reaching out in 8 or 9 different directions from one pipe, so to speak, is how that works. And so the natural gas is forced from the shale. And at this point in time, in the regions where we're from in the United States, the amount of gas available has tripled, quadrupled. And so what has happened is the natural gas is just cheaper than coal. So while you've seen that graph there, it has little to do with natural gas being cleaner. It has to do with it being cheaper. And so kind of in spite of what's going on in our current administration, we are becoming a cleaner power generation because of that move. It was interesting, I was talking to one gentleman in the audience here that's from Kentucky, which is a coal producing state along with Pennsylvania and Ohio, and there are a lot of people that are concerned about that, and there have been job losses. But a lot of that is, like I said, more about the economics of natural gas and not necessarily about the the regulations put in place. The other thing that is kind of an interesting point, in California, about 39% of their electricity now is produced from renewables. And it's came up over the last several years, this concept called the duck curve, where you see the two ends of the duck. You see where renewables generation has started to basically in the morning and the afternoon, you've got two peaks, so to speak, of energy production. So in the early morning, you've got a lot of windmills that are producing electricity. However, it drops off in the late morning and creates that valley, so to speak. And then later on in the afternoon, solar starts coming on. But as you can see, from 2013 to 15, the depth of the valley has gotten greater. What that ends up doing is you'll be driving through some areas and they literally will turn off the windmills because there's too much electricity. It can't be used. And so what that also then creates is a problem with what they call base load, or what's needed to during those peaks of time to make sure when you turn your light switch on, you have power. It seems like everybody wants lights on when they turn their light switch on, just not in the morning and the afternoon. And so the problem starts to become not if you want renewables, but how do you manage renewables when they don't produce? So this is really kind of, and it happens everywhere that has a renewable portfolio, so to speak. And that's really, it's not if you want renewables, it's how do you manage renewables within your overall portfolio, because you need to have your electricity produce when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And so what California has done now is moved much more into managing their base loads, so to speak, and try to respond to this problem. And here's the profile of France, so to speak. You have a much larger renewable and non-fossil fuels than the United States does. Did I go backwards? I guess not. So here's a couple of things that's going on. While the Trump administration, the national administration, has backed off on a number of the rules that they have proposed, and I think it's been like 67 or 80 rules that they've backed off, including pulling out of the Paris agreement. What is happening, the local governments, state governments, and corporations are really still moving towards developing of alternatives. And here what you see is in the Great Lakes, which you see Ohio circled there. I always like to say that Ohio is a place that people fly over when they're going from Chicago to New York, but there's people that live there. So we're looking at putting a number of wind turbines in the Great Lakes that will save about $3 million a year in power. What also is happening is using landfills, putting solar panels on those landfills. And that's going to combine about 80 megawatts. A megawatt is about what powers a large grocery store or convenience store. The university probably would use a megawatt of electricity during a day. So if you can imagine, there'd be enough to power 80 of these on a daily basis from that comparison. Wind, they're also going to be producing about 9.8 megawatts of offshore wind in conjunction with a major company. What was it? I can't remember. I apologize, I forget the name. What was it? Mitsubishi, wasn't it? Investus, yes. And that kind of brings it to what we're doing here. What you see there is a fuel cell hydrogen bus. And what that is, a fuel cell actually creates electricity from an electrical chemical process versus burning it. One of the interesting things, we have it drawn to national attention, and yes, if you do see me in front, you see me kind of hiding behind the one gentleman, that's Prince Albert of Monaco. He actually did look at my bus, which I thought was interesting. He went to see my bus. I didn't know when you met the prince if you should bow or have a sword or what exactly, but he was a very nice guy. But generally, this is what a fuel cell looks like. So what happens, I'll try not to get too technical here, but what happens is hydrogen goes in one side of the fuel cell, and there's actually an anode and a cathode, like a normal battery. The protons then will go through a membrane and through an active layer, and what will happen is the hydrogen will combine with oxygen and release one electron, and that electron then goes to power the vehicle. And the only thing that is the waste that comes out is water. So what happens here is you have a complete conversion of the input fuel that happens without being burned. Okay, I want to make sure I wasn't getting too fast there. So then what happens from there, you can see the bus at the top right. This is actually, the vehicle is powered then by an electric motors. So you have an internal, you have a complete vehicle, this electric vehicle. So basically now you've got two types of vehicles, battery electric, like a Tesla, or you have the fuel cell vehicles like this one, and you've got all the major automotive makers in the country, in the world, that are producing these at this point. And Toyota, which is the largest car maker in the world, has said by 2050 that they will no longer produce an internal combustion engine. And you're starting to see France, Paris, London are saying that they will no longer allow either the sale or internal combustion engines to be within their cities. So this is something that is definitely coming across the world. What you see up in the upper, my far left is actually a hydrogen station that we built at our facility. It's actually the largest one in the country at this point in time in the United States, and it's probably one of the largest ones in the world. What that large tank that looks like a rocket, it's actually as big as a rocket, is a hydrogen tank, and actually holds hydrogen at minus 430 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what it is in Celsius, but it's really cold. Let's just say if you get your hand in it, it's going to break off. So it holds hydrogen in a liquid state, and that large silver thing you see converts it into a gas, and then it's actually compressed and put on the buses. There's tanks on the buses, and it's stored at 370 bar on the vehicles. What you see in the back there is in the lower right-hand side, where you would see a diesel engine, is actually the fuel cell converters and electrical transmission. So really what you're starting to see here, and that's why I was saying that you're starting to see the merging of the energy streams with oil and gas and electric, is we're starting to see the electric drive vehicles overtake internal combustion engines. The issue and the question started to become, how do our electric infrastructure and fueling infrastructure handle those things? And those are some of the things that we're dealing with now in the U.S. So we've been talking about, we held the North American Fuel Cell Bus Conference in Canton, where we had representatives all over the world come to us. And why this is important, we've been working with a number of national laboratories, the Argonne National Laboratory, the National Renewable Laboratory, to roll out these vehicles. We've also been doing this in conjunction with systems in California. We were also awarded recently a grant from the US EPA to develop the first ever smaller bus with the Nissan company to put forward these vehicles. So this is kind of what's going on with the vehicle deployment all over the United States. One thing I did want to mention about this, and this is actually being pushed forward by one of the national laboratories, is really hydrogen at scale, and still the U.S. Department of Energy. What is interesting that's happened, even though the current Secretary of Energy in the administration likes coal, they're still moving forward with some of these renewable and energy at scale. And I think there is some recognition that the coal and natural gas, while it's good, can't meet everything. And so really what you're seeing here is how hydrogen can be used as both a energy storage method and an energy distribution method. It's kind of a busy graph, but basically what it's saying that we can generate hydrogen from either solar, wind, geothermal. I was just in Iceland when we came over here, and they use all of their geothermal energy from the ground, so to speak, and nuclear. So there's a way that we could have a complete renewable energy loop with using hydrogen, and this is one of the things that we're trying to push forward. Another kind of busy slide here is really moving our entire fleet to a zero-emission basis. One of the other interesting concepts, even in this graph here, if you'll see there's like this little tank thing that's up in the left-hand side, is called a biodigester. It's where you would imagine taking all your food waste that you eat and basically putting it into a large tank, and then bacteria eat it. And when the bacteria eats it, it releases both methane and carbon dioxide. And you can actually take the methane then and either turn it into, it's natural gas, and either turn it into electricity or hydrogen. So what we're talking about, there's a number of energy loops that we can do with either taking our garbage and make it into electricity, or using renewable energy to find electricity. And the interesting thing about using this food waste concept, it's literally anything that's organic. You can use grass clippings, your food waste, paper, anything that's organic, you can put in that with the bugs, so to speak, and through a process called anaerobic digestion. The bugs eat the stuff and convert it into energy. And so the interesting thing about this, if we can divert it from landfills, this process is actually carbon neutral. It's actually taking carbon out of the environment. Just a couple of things that's going on here in the UK or Europe. They're starting to roll out a number of these buses, and they actually look at this concept as a leading adopter of these technologies. Here's a couple breakdowns of what's happening across Europe. Interesting enough, right now, my organization has as many fuel cell buses as London, England, which they'll probably pass me quickly, but it's nice to say I have more than London. Here's a couple of other things that's going on across the country, and you can see that they're starting to move forward on this. Interesting thing here in France, 2019, they're starting with 6 projects to get a total of 29 fuel cell vehicles. Put in comparison, my agency, we'll have 17 by the end of next year. So I think what we wanted to try to talk about today was really, one, while some of our national politics and discussions have changed, the one thing you need to think about too is we have 50 states in the United States, and energy policy really is at the state level dominated. So just because there's a change in any president, they really can't change how California, how Ohio, how the states really move forward. So really, companies, locals, and the state governments really are still in a leadership position and driving the agenda on how energy policy is in our country. Normally, we haven't even had a national energy policy as the United States because it's just our system normally is those kind of issues are reserved to the states. And so having a national policy, basically, we don't have very many national policies at all when it comes to this kind of stuff. So it's not atypical what you're seeing. But I think the development of energy is starting to move forward more strongly with the state, local, and the corporate level. I think this is you, isn't it?
Yeah. So actually, we're going to go through a couple of conclusion points. And thank you, Kirt. You were actually very eloquent. Even the technical details made sense for me. It was more business focused scholar than technician. So conclusion number one, I think, as mentioned, due to the economic factors and cheaper natural gas, many legacy or old power plants based on coal are closing down or getting converted to natural gas, which is referred to as quote unquote, or en parenthèse, clean coal plants. Many people don't agree with the clean coal statement. They do not believe that there's such thing as clean coal. But that being said, this is number one point. Number two, many utility companies are trying to re-regulate the markets. Because they are facing economic problems, they are pushing for subsidies of coal and nuclear power generation and fighting renewables as a market threat. So it's basically, you know, the reluctance to change, right? This is human behavior at its best. Utility companies, as you know, are not necessarily the most competitive, and they're risk averse. They want to hold on to their subsidies, which is a natural fact. So they're fighting the renewables, even if people, in most cases, would prefer to have them. Number three, France has a much more modern and advanced smart grid and distributed generation system model. As we saw it earlier, the portion of renewable energies in France is much greater than in the US, so I think France, number one, should be proud of it. Number two, there may be areas of collaboration possible. So sharing some of these experiences or best practices would be very good, actually, for the future, including maybe a transatlantic collaboration, maybe something between Ohio and the region here. The US could learn a great deal from France, that's for sure. Number four, energy paradigm shift. Oil and gas and electric energy production and consumption streams are starting to merge in the US. I think that's a very important point that Kirt made several times. And number five, as a result of the current administration's refocus on fossil fuel, some corporations, cities, and states, especially in California, have taken the leadership role in sustainable energy development. States set the energy, as Kirt mentioned, not the federal government. So I think this is the result of a tension. And I know that tensions are very popular in this school. So I think this is probably, the opportunity to research this new tension, which is really, really strong, again, because you have a president with an agenda that's America first. America first being also domestic in nature, but the fact of the matter is the domestic economy of the US cannot function without the international connections between oil and gas producers, consumers, the markets. As mentioned, the first major change actually took place about a year and a half ago, and it was not the Trump administration, it was the Obama administration, but it was a result of a lot of lobbying by the oil and gas industry. The crude oil from the US is now exported from the US to Europe, to Latin America, Russia, you name it, China. So I think we see this tension basically materializing in the fact that the states, the companies, and the local communities are taking ownership of the development of their renewable industry, even if the federal government is asking for something else or is trying to prescribe something else. So research questions, could be these and or additional questions. Of course, these are just examples because I do think that more research is needed, as we say. Number one, will history repeat itself with the US refocusing on fossil fuels? Number two, how will America First policy that I just mentioned impact the EU's energy policy and priorities? Again, in the light of the tariff, the importation taxes being imposed on aluminum, steel, photovoltaic panels and washing machines. The US is becoming focused on America first. Protectionism is definitely there. What does it mean for the international community, the global economy, and especially the different policies that the EU is going to either put in place? There could be retaliation against those tariffs. That remains to be seen, but this is happening actually as we speak, right? So it's a very interesting and timely topic. And the third possible research question would be what Ohio best practices actually should be adopted nationally in the US. Some of them are already being adopted, because you saw that some national organizations and agencies are funding, right, with millions of dollars, what Ohio has been doing, what Kirt has been doing with his organization. Should also those best practices be adopted internationally? That's the next question. And then last but not least, how will the American energy policy affect oil prices and the environment? I certainly hope that the next time I present this, I'm not going to have a third slide on yet another oil spill or anything like this. But oil and gas is not going to disappear anytime soon. We hope that what we argued about having a smart energy policy, including renewables, is going to happen. Thank you very much. Merci.
Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yes.
So the one thing, he asked, what's the cost differential of diesel and fuel cell? The one thing, interesting thing is a fuel cell will get about double the mileage. And so the cost of hydrogen per gallon is a diesel. Yeah, they are more expensive at this point in time. They're about 40% higher. However, a lot of that has to do with manufacturing. You know, if you think about whenever the large screen TVs came out, you know, they were several, you know, probably tens of thousands of dollars or euros. Now you can basically get one out of a, you know, a vending machine in the hallway for $5. And that's the same kind of thing as once we get the production ramped up, we think that, especially in the U.S., we're targeting to be about the same price. Here in Europe, the fuel cell buses are actually the same amount basically as a diesel electric hybrid. So we're on the pathway to being equal.
If we see cars, trains, buses, other modes of transportation shifting to a fuel cell, will that drive up the costs appreciably for hydrogen and then make it inefficient at that point from a cost standpoint? I'm thinking if everything shifts within 20 years, is it going to be very costly?
Well, I've heard the comparisons of saying that when you first got cars, you had to go to a pharmacist to buy gas, and there wasn't the network or the supply of it. And so what has happened, and what probably will happen, is that the market will expand as demand expands. And so you talk to people like Air Liquide, which is a big, you know, very big in France, Air Products, those companies are basically now produce hydrogen in these gases for use in industry. And so what you're starting to see here again is that merging of streams, that the industrial gas companies will start becoming mobility or transportation gas companies. And so there's a number of changes that you're going to see. We haven't even started talking about autonomous or self-driving vehicles, but what you're going to see in energy and transportation in the future is as big as moving from horse and buggy to car. And so, I mean, it's that big in our economies.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. So you You said that the energy policy is decided at the state level, but I might be wrong, but I thought that the funding of research is decided at the national level. So how has evolved the funding of research in the area of renewable energy since the election of Donald Trump?
So within the, there's 13 cabinet departments. And the president submitted his first budget where he had cut a lot of the research, specifically within the Department of Energy. There's an organization called the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Administration, EERE, that they actually cut a lot of their funding on their proposal, and they moved it from implementation to just pure research. However, as I was reminded, as the Congress takes the president's budget, looks at it and throws it in the trash and writes their own. And so this year, we didn't get an entire budget in fiscal year 18. Let's just say that the U.S. Congressional budgeting process is about as clean as a tornado. It's pretty messy. And if I tried to explain to you how it all worked, it would probably take another 2 days. Sometimes I don't even understand it. So we didn't even have a full budget this year. You probably heard about the government shutdown where we decided we didn't want to have a government anymore. And we shut it down for a couple of days. And so that all reflects all of that. But in the end, what Congress ended up doing through their smaller budgets was basically keep energy research at the levels that it had been previously. Now the 19 budget that's coming up went back to what it was before, so we'll see what happens. I know that, kind of answer your question, there's definitely a tension between Congress and the president on renewables and how things work. Even the big tax bill that went through, the administration and leadership in Congress did not want to see, there's a credit you get if you buy an electric vehicle, but somehow it ended up staying in. So there's still a lot of stuff that stayed in because the renewable industry has a lot of traction, so to speak, in Congress. So a lot of it has stayed, but it has reduced a little bit. Sorry to give you such a long answer to a question, but.
Thank you. That was a great question. Next.
Yes, hi. Thank
Hi.
you for the presentation.
Sure.
I have one question about you show us all the different energy grid and the production.
Yeah.
But my question is about, is there some national or state policies focused on the consumption to decrease the level of consumption for people in different fields?
So, for example, like in Japan, right, where after Fukushima, they basically said we need to consume less, and
yeah, like in
right?
urbanism and transportation, but not focus on which kind of energy you use, but try first to use less energy by do some like urbanism policies or I don't know.
Right.
It depends. There are some, like I said, within the Department of Energy, they have EERE, which talks about energy conservation. However, a lot of the utilities, the way that they're set up, if you conserve energy, then they don't make money. So conservation isn't as big of an issue as production, if that makes any, because the way the privatization is. I mean, at the end of the day, let's just take, for example, the power grid that serves both of us. They're called First Energy. They're the largest multi-billion-dollar utility that serves everywhere from almost Chicago to part of New York. You know, they've got thousands and thousands of employees. They've got the plants they have to retire the debt on, and so they want to sell as much electricity as possible. So you've got that force that are saying, no, we don't want anything to do with conservation. Then you've got the other side that says, you know, we need to conserve. The other interesting thing that's going on, even in Canada and the United States, there is an overproduction of electricity by about 30%. At different times, you go back to that duck curve. And so the question is, that sometimes we have too much electricity that can't be consumed, which almost seems against what you're thinking about. So there's a couple different real problems, so to speak, on the incentives, where it needs to be regulated, and just using less electricity.
So I'm going to give you a perspective, actually, based on my experience in the US for 20 plus years, which is cross-cultural perspective on this question. First, I think if you have traveled to the US, if you've seen the movies, whatever, you see the size of houses, right? So the size of houses, the size of cars, the space, I think convenience comes to mind. So reducing consumption, is not necessarily convenient. When we go to our hotel here, we have the little magic card, right? We plug it in to get power. I've not seen many hotels like... Yes, and energy is so much cheaper in the US. So we consume, we want convenience. Plugging in a little card to have power is like a headache, right? For Americans, they don't like inconvenience. Second thing I would say is consumption is a national sport. So it's also maybe for good or bad reasons. You can make your own opinion, but the fact is it's more than 2/3 of the GDP, right? So if we want to grow the GDP, the economy of the US, we have to consume. If we're not consuming, we need to reduce our trade deficit, which with our policies, not sure that's going to happen, but it is what it is. It's endemic, it's structural. If you're not increasing consumption or reducing your trade deficit, then basically the equation is linear. You have to increase government spending or investment. Same thing. Americans, again, are national consumers. They don't save, they don't invest as much as France or Europe or China. So I think, if you had a policy where you nudged people to reduce consumption of energy, there would be a lot of pushback based on the culture. And the culture is consumption, convenience, and it's cheap. We don't care. We leave the lights on. It's still happening in my house. Drives me crazy. We're not using some rooms, but we need to have light, right? Because it's convenient anyway. And dark is scary. So,
Okay.
Yes, another question.
You were talking about funding for research.
Yes.
But from a European or German perspective, I've got the question, the renewable energies are so successful or so big in Germany because they are massively funded not only by the state, but by every citizen, because the state imposed these laws that basically say renewables first. So that was the incentive for private companies or also many individuals to invest in renewables, in wind, in solar power facilities. But I think more market liberal country like the US, what are the incentives there to install renewable energies? Apparently there are, otherwise people would not do it.
Yeah, there are incentives. It depends on where you're at. California actually has a cap and trade system for carbon, and so they're leading the United States. There's a saying in the United States that California will soon be visiting you in a neighborhood near you. Basically, what happens in California, in a few years you'll see in the rest of the country. So that's one thing, is that you've got 36 million people that live in basically 20% of the population lives in one state, and so their policies kind of dominate the rest of the country. Just kind of give you an example. So you've got California and 13 other states that have adopted the California air quality rules that are higher than the federal ones. And so that's where the companies are starting to sell their vehicles at this point in time, and that's where they can get a federal credit and a state credit. So that's one thing that happens, is you've got basically it's the states on the coast that are driving this. And even in other states, you still have, hate to talk too politically here, but about 3 or 4 years ago, and it wasn't even under this administration, but that even in my state, we had what's called a renewable energy portfolio or standard that was passed unanimously by both parties in our General Assembly and signed by a then it was a Republican governor, that said a certain set-aside said that you had to have 20% of your energy production be renewable. And so that has stayed. It just seems like recently that we've kind of moved back, so to speak, and some of that stuff's starting to unwind. But once you put something in place, it's hard to pull it back. So there have been standards in place. California kind of dominates, and a lot of this stuff is already in play. And I think the other thing too is solar power now is actually cheaper than even some of the renewables are just cheaper, point blank. And so you can make an entire market play just on that. Just kind of an example, we had a slide in here. So what you're starting to see though is the industry starting to come back and try to use market regulation to keep them out. So in my state, in Ohio, we have the largest property setbacks. In other words, if a windmill's here and this is somebody's house here, it has to be so far from that. And we have the highest setbacks requirements in the world. It has to be almost like 500 meters away, which is there's no safety reason. There's no reason other than this guy doesn't like wind and he got it put in a bill. And so there's a lot of that nonsense that happens. But we're trying to move that back, so to speak. Okay. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Hi. Just a question about shale gas that you mentioned. There's
Yes.
a push in the US for the development of shale gas. As you said, it's because it's cheaper than coal. But shale gas is peculiar. As you said, hydraulic fracking has its own issues in terms of destroying the underground and sending contaminants and chemicals in the underground, contaminating the aquifers, contaminating the soils. People have been affected. We've seen gas coming out of taps in houses. People can light a fire with the water coming out of their tap. So is there any national debate about the development of shale gas in the US, or maybe at state level, or is it just acquired that we'll keep on developing shale gas production?
That's a very good question. So we have seen some of those videos also about flames coming out of the faucet, and we've heard about earthquakes. We've heard about contamination. And basically, back to the earlier debates, money talks, right? So basically, there are a lot of investments are pouring into fracking. Number one. Number two, if you ask the leaders in that field, if you ask them the same question, they'll say, well, but no, that was the old story. What we do today is clean, right? We contain those issues with technology. We isolate, the aquifer or the water basin from any polluting elements. So they always come back with, we got it controlled. We'll put money toward the problem, right? We'll throw money at the problem to fix it with technology. If it's done right, if it's installed right, nothing bad happens. And then basically I have some friends whose parents have sold their land, because agriculture becoming more challenging in the US. They have sold their land to fracking companies, and they have made such an amount of money that it's basically hard to refuse that amount of money. So, Kirt can expand on that.
So like the state of New York doesn't allow any hydraulic fracking at all. I believe the state of Delaware doesn't. Or the state I live in, Ohio, does. In the state that Pennsylvania does. So it's really a state-by-state issue. The federal government has, under the Obama administration, did put some regulations in place, however that's been backed off. The big issue really is, what, and kind of get technical here, what the problem is that, I'm going to sound kind of pro and against here in my comments, just kind of warn you. So the issue with flames out of your sink, so to speak, that could have happened in any type of drilling, either the traditional horizontal or fracking, because you can get natural gas that will come up through. through. What ends up happening is if you don't plug those old wells, then you've got issues with that. And most of the time with the aquifer, that's only about maybe up to 500 feet down. We have water, and then after that, it's solid. So really, the issue is casing down to through the aquifer is an issue. That's assuming you do it right. But like I said, through my area, there's probably not been a piece of earth that has been dug up or holes poked in it for natural gas. By my parents' house, they literally put in about $1 billion separator, they call it. They're building another $5 billion processing plant not too far from us. In my community, we just live in, went through a big court battle to try to stop a pipeline going through. Even in my community where we live, they had spilled probably about 500,000 gallons of this fracking fluid into a creek. And so there's definitely issues, and the issue is whether or not the regulators will hold it in place.
Claire, that's it for the questions, but we are available online and face-to-face for a few hours. Thank you again to Grenoble École de Management and to all of you. Thank you.